People love to debate about whether or not things happen for a reason or if the universe is just messy. You know how it goes. One person has a weird experience and calls it a sign, and someone else shrugs and says, it's just a coincidence. And honestly, most of the time, it is a coincidence. A weird noise, a strange sight, a feeling that you can't quite describe. Our brain jumps in and tries to explain it. It's just what we do. But every so often, a small town will look back on a moment and say, okay, that was odd. Not over the top, not supernatural, just odd. Something people remembered because it didn't fit everyday normal activities. And that's where our story begins, in that little space between coincidence and meaning, where people start to wonder if the strange thing they noticed was just a blip or something that they were supposed to notice.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
People have always tried to make sense of the strange things that happen around them. Long before science, weather apps, or 24-hour news cycles, people watched the world closely. From the sky, the animals, to the little shifts in their everyday routines. And they tried to read meaning in what they saw. Sometimes those moments were comforting. Sometimes they were unsettling. But every single culture has its own stories and explanations about signs or omens or warnings, something that shows up before a big shift or a change. For example, a bird behaving oddly, a dream that felt heavy, an unexpected event that makes people pause and trade looks with their neighbors. Whether anyone calls them omens or not, these moments have shaped traditions, rituals, and the way communities talk about the unknown or the universe. Some of these beliefs go back thousands of years. In ancient Rome, for example, there were people whose entire jobs were to watch the natural world and offer guidance based on what they saw. The way that birds flew or the way the wind shifted, the timing of unusual events and waves and lunar cycles. In Mesopotamia, early observers kept careful notes on the sky and on the animals' behaviors, hoping it might help them understand what was going to come next. Those practices eventually fed into early astrology, which still shows up in modern life in one form or another. At the heart of it all is something very human. It's the urge to understand what we can't control. When life feels unpredictable, people look for clues and patterns, anything to help them feel a little more prepared. Sometimes those clues turn into stories, and sometimes they turn into warnings, and sometimes they become the kind of tales that a town will never forget. Cats, especially black ones, have been tangled up with the occult for ages. If there was someone considered a witch within 100 miles, someone would absolutely be pointing at her cat like, yep, that's her little magical sidekick right there. Black cats, they get the full folklore treatment. Depending on where you are in the world, they are either tiny good luck charms or furry little omens of doom. In Britain and Japan, black cats are basically walking good fortune tokens. People love them, people want them. Meanwhile, in the United States, we somehow decided the exact same animal was bad luck. Same cat, different continent, totally different vibes. And then you get into the really specific superstitions, the ones that sound like they were invented by someone's great-great-great-great-grandmother after one weird night. In old Italian folklore, if a black cat sits at the bedside of someone who is sick, it means that that person isn't going to make it. In other places, if you hear a black cat meowing at midnight, it supposedly means that someone nearby is about to die. Midnight meows, adorable or apocalyptic, all depending on your culture. And that whole black cat crossing your pathing, oh, it comes with rules. If a cat walks towards you, congratulations, prosperity is on its way. If it walks away from you, crosses left to right, or changes its mind halfway through, well, that's bad luck. And if a black cat crosses in front of a funeral procession, According to the superstition, you might as well start preparing for a second funeral because another family member is supposedly next. All this, of course, has nothing to do with the cats themselves. They're just out there living their best lives, knocking things off of shelves and judging us from across the room. And they accidentally carry centuries of superstitions on their tiny little shoulders. Crows and ravens have been carrying the death bird reputation for centuries, and honestly, they didn't stand a chance. They're black-feathered, loud, bold, smart enough to solve puzzles, and absolutely not afraid to stare you down like they know your browser history. So of course people decided that they were tied to witches, omens, and the occasional devil-in-disguise cameo. Ravens especially got the VIP treatment in mythology. In Norse lore, Odin literally has 2 of them, and they're flying around the world gathering intel for him. Because of that, Vikings slapped ravens on everything: banners, armor, ships, and naturally, people that they were conquering were like, oh great, here comes the death birds again, which didn't exactly help the ravens' PR. English folklore took things even further. Ravens weren't just spooky, they were full-on messengers of doom, storms, floods, war, disease. If something terrible was about to happen, people swore a raven would show up first. They are believed to predict death, which honestly makes sense when you remember that they can smell carrion from far away, and their croaking calls sound suspiciously like corpse, corpse. A raven calling on your left in the morning? Bad luck. Seeing 2 of them together? Even worse. Spotting one near a sick person? According to tradition, that person's time was up. And then there are crows, the smaller, sassier cousins who somehow inherited all the same superstitions plus a few extras. A crow tapping on your window? Bad news. Circling your head? Good luck. That's even worse. Showing up in a churchyard, cawing 3 times near your house, flying over the same house 3 times, or the ultimate nope, landing on your roof. All classic signs that death is supposedly on the way. Basically, if a crow or raven did anything other than mind its own business, someone somewhere decided it meant doom. Meanwhile, the birds themselves are just out there being clever, dramatic, and maybe a little too comfortable for their own good. Owls also get pulled into a lot of old superstitions about death. One of the most common ones says that if you're out at night and you hear an owl calling from above, it means that someone in your family is about to kick the bucket. Another says that an owl sitting on your roof is a bad sign for someone you know, hopefully someone you don't like very much. There are also stories that are tied to specific people. One of the most well-known story involves the Roman Empire Antonius. The story goes that an owl was seen sitting above his bedroom door shortly before he died, and that detail ended up being repeated for centuries. Now, if we jump ahead to the 1960s, there's this little town in West Virginia called Point Pleasant. Back then it was a pretty normal place, just a small, quiet town where everyone knew everyone and nothing wild ever made the news. But just outside of town, there was this strange leftover from World War II. They called it the old TNT area. It was a whole spread of concrete bunkers, storage igloos, and abandoned buildings tucked into the woods. By the 60s, nobody was using it anymore, but teenagers went there to hang out, hunters passed through it, and most adults didn't bother with it unless they absolutely had to. The whole place had this weird Cold War vibe: empty structures, old government property signs, long stretches of lands that hadn't been touched in years. It was the kind of spot that people joked about, but they never took too seriously. And then Point Pleasant ended up with something so strange that the entire town started to pay attention, and later, so did the rest of the world. November 2nd, 1966 started out like any other ordinary night for Woody Derenberger. He was headed home after a long day on the road, driving south on the I-77 from Marietta. It was around 7:30 in the evening, already dark thanks to the season. He was in his panel truck doing the same commute that he had done more times than he could count. Traffic was light. A few cars here and there, their headlights cutting through the dark as he got closer to the Stoughton Avenue exit. One car passed him, and another followed behind it, staying close. That second vehicle pulled in front of him and slowed down, forcing him to ease off the gas. At first, he didn't really think much of it until his headlights hit it. This thing wasn't touching the road. It was hovering over a foot off the ground, and it wasn't shaped like a car he had seen before. It was long, around 30 feet, and shaped more like a stovepipe than anything with wheels. A door opened, and a man stepped out into the beam of Woody's headlights. He looked completely normal at first glance. Tan skin, slick back hair, button-down shirt, trousers with a little bit of a metallic shine. Nothing wild, nothing futuristic, just a well-dressed man standing in the middle of road at night with this weird vehicle. He walked right up to Woody's truck and started talking, except he wasn't exactly talking. Woody realized halfway through that the man wasn't moving his mouth at all. The conversation had been happening directly in his head. The man asked him questions about the area, asked a few questions about personal things, and kept reassuring him that there was no reason to be scared. When Woody finally asked who he was, the man plainly replied, "I'm called Cold." Woody's story hit the news the very next day, and people all over Ohio Valley were suddenly talking about him. A week later, on November 10th, the weather kind of dropped again. Days were shorter, colder, and the nights came faster. In a cemetery outside of Clendenin, 5 men were out working, grave diggers, used to long days and tough jobs. They weren't the type to jump at shadows. They were out working, and something moved above the tree line. They all saw it. It wasn't a bird that they recognized. It was brown, large, and shaped like a person. It glided over them without a sound, kept going. On November 15th, it was a regular Tuesday night for Salem, West Virginia resident Merle Partridge. Sometimes you may hear his name as Newell Partridge, but this was to protect his actual identity when the author wrote the book Mothman Prophecies. So Merle is home one night watching TV a little after 10 p.m. when the TV set starts acting up. The picture broke into strange patterns and this awful humming noise kicked in. It got louder until the screen went completely black. Bandit, his German shepherd, was restless the entire time. The dog kept pacing on the porch, focusing on something out towards the far end of the property. Merle noticed how agitated he was getting, so he grabbed his shotgun and stepped outside to see what the hell was going on. The yard was dark, that kind of rural darkness you get when there aren't any streetlights out, pitch black. Bandit keeps growling and staring out into the field, but Merle doesn't see anything at first. Then he spots 2 red circles in the distance, bright enough to stand out. They weren't headlights, they weren't reflections from an animal eyes, they were just there, circling the area. Bandit bolts straight towards them, barking nonstop as he ran across the property and into the field. Merle listened to him bark until the sound faded completely away, and then nothing. No movement, no barking, no sign of Bandit at all. Merle wanted to go after him, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the porch. He stayed there with the shotgun in his hand, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to move. Bandit never came back. There would soon be other reports of these large glowing red circles, the same ones that Merle saw, and he would always say that they looked like bicycle reflectors staring at him from the field. Later that same night, about 90 miles away in Point Pleasant, Roger and Linda Scarberry were out with their friends Steve and Mary Mallet. They were driving through the TNT area. They'd been through those roads plenty of times, and it was late enough that the whole place was particularly quiet. As they passed one of the old power plant buildings, their headlights caught something standing near the road. They all saw it at the same time, a dark, tall figure, upright and shaped like a person, but definitely not a person. Linda later said that it had the build of a slender, muscular man. It stood somewhere around 6 to 7 feet tall, and its wings were folded behind its back, white or gray, depending on how the light hit them. The part that scared them the most were the eyes. 2 bright circles spaced about 6 inches apart and big enough that you couldn't miss them. Linda said that the eyes had this strange pull to them, like they were the only things that you could focus on. The creature stepped towards the road, and Roger, he didn't wait around to see what it had planned to do. He hit the gas, and the car shot forward. They sped off, and a high-pitched screech came from behind them, sharp enough that everyone in the car spun around to look. A moment later, the creature lifted off the ground and came after them. Now, it didn't just glide for a second and then drop back down. It stayed with them. It flew above the car, behind it, sometimes off to the side. It kept pace, even with Roger pushing the car faster and faster. All of the people said that it could easily match the speed of the vehicle. They could hear its wings at moments, and not just flapping wildly, but adjusting as it stayed with them. The red eyes visible the entire time, glowing in the dark. The chase didn't stop until they reached the lights of Point Pleasant. Once they hit town, the creature finally veered off and disappeared. Let's go straight to the sheriff's office. Deputy Millard Halstead knows the kids personally, and he takes what they have to say very seriously. Officers go to check the area, but they didn't find anything. Roger had even talked about seeing the body of a large dog at the site earlier near the side of the road, but even this was gone when police went to go check. The next day, the couple's story runs in the local newspaper. There's this local reporter, Mary Heyer, who covers the area for the Athens Messenger. And she wrote that the couple described a creature around 6 or 7 foot tall, with a 10-foot wingspan and red eyes about 2 inches across and 6 inches apart. Once the article was out, more people started talking. 2 volunteer firemen said that they had seen a large bird with red eyes. Mason County Sheriff George Johnson said that he thought people were seeing an unusually big heron, which he called a shitepoke. Wildlife biologist Dr. Robert L. Smith told reporters that the description matched a sandhill crane, a bird with a 7-foot wingspan and red coloring around its eyes, even though this wasn't normally found in the area. People also started to talk about losing track of time during their encounters with this creature, which only added to the confusion because cranes and herons don't make you forget stuff. Now, there's a lot of local newspapers that are writing about this stuff, including the Point Pleasant Register. But they had a problem. No one could decide what it was, which meant nobody knew what to call it. They needed something catchy, something weird, something that would make people pick up the paper and go, "I'm sorry, what?" And lucky for them, the cultural moment handed them the perfect solution. The Batman TV show, the campy, colorful, pow, zap, biff one, well, that was huge at the time. Every kid was watching it, every adult knew it, and the show had introduced a villain named Killer Moth. He was sort of a bargain bin Batman with wings, stripes, and a deeply questionable fashion sense. So, when staff needed to come up with a headline, they basically went, well, he's big, he's winged, he's spooky, and Batman's popular right now. Let's just call him Mothman, and boom, a legend was born. Regardless of whatever this thing actually was, the sightings kept coming. By November 24th, Point Pleasant wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. The story had jumped into national news, and suddenly the town was full of people who had no business being there. Journalists, TV crews, cryptozoologists, and the naturally curious all rolled in, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever everyone was talking about. The funny thing was, Mothman only ever showed up when he felt like it, so most of these visitors spent their time wandering around the TNT area with cameras and notebooks and nothing to show for it. Now, one of the people who came into town was John Keel. He was 36 at the time and already knee-deep into strange stories. Playboy had asked him to write an article on UFOs earlier that year. The magazine ended up rejecting it, but the assignment pulled him straight into that UFO world. He started traveling all over the country, talking to witnesses, collecting stories, and by 1966, he was already calling his work Operation Trojan Horse. So when reports started coming out of Point Pleasant about a winged creature and strange lights in the sky, Keel headed straight there, and he wasn't just chasing Mothman, he was chasing a whole wave of UFO activity across the Ohio Valley. People were reporting bright lights, hovering crafts, cigar-shaped objects, glowing spheres, and silent moments overhead. Keel didn't think any of it was a spacecraft. He believed that it was something older, something that had been around long before anyone had ever started using the word UFO. So Keel gets into town around the 7th of December, and he goes straight to the sheriff's office, and he talks to Halstead, who's handling most of the reports. Keel asks him if anyone has mentioned anything strange besides the creature, and he's met with no, just the Mothman. But Keel keeps pushing, and Halstead finally tells him that he should go talk to Mabel McDaniels because she's seen the creature herself, and she hasn't exactly been quiet about it. Keel is invited over to her place, and when he finally gets to Mabel's, she's not alone. She was more than willing to talk about what she had seen, and she had gathered a small group of people who had their own encounters. The Scarsberries were there, the Mallets were there, and so was the local reporter Mary Heyer. She had become one of the main people documenting everything at Point Pleasant. Mary also brought her niece, Connie Carpenter, and the first thing Keel noticed about Connie was her eyes. They were red and irritated. She kept blinking like they were sore. Connie told him that she had developed pink eye right after her encounter with the creature. She said that the creature locked eyes with her and she couldn't pull herself away, like something was trying to hold her attention. She said it felt like it was trying to tell her something, but she had no idea what that something was. Keel explains that some UFOs were known to give off strong ultraviolet light. If someone got too close or if the UV rays were too strong, that UV exposure could cause an eye condition called photoconjunctivitis. It's basically non-bacterial pink eye, and it shows up fast after an encounter. Hearing Connie describe her symptoms right after seeing the creature lined up with everything he knew about UFO and extraterrestrial encounters. The more he listened, the more he noticed that a lot of what these people had to say was similar in UFO cases. People were losing time. They talked about feeling frozen and unable to move. They talked about a sense of dread that hit them out of nowhere. These weren't just random stories to him. They matched the same kind of reports that he had been collecting all over the country. There with Mabel, Mary, Connie, and the two couples, Keel wasn't surprised. To him, this fit into the larger wave of the strange activity he'd been following across the Ohio Valley. And now he had even more reason to believe that whatever was happening in Point Pleasant was connected to something much bigger. And after meeting with the group, he and Mary teamed up and started checking in with each other about different stories that people had been bringing to them. Word spread fast around town, and more people were coming forward with their own encounters. One of those stories comes from Marcella Bennett. She was walking out towards her car with her baby when she saw something rise up from the ground directly behind her vehicle. She said it was huge, bigger than a man, and the shock of seeing it startled her so badly that she actually dropped her baby. She scoops her kid back up and she takes off the other way. Marcella also reported seeing red lights hovering in the sky that same night. She was very clear that they were not airplane lights. She knows what planes look like, and this was something completely different. Another night, around 2 a.m, people along the Ohio River reported seeing a giant disc hovering over the water. It was just sitting there above the river in the dark. Later that same night, another man said that he saw what he believed was the same disc, only this time it was on the ground near the riverbank. He said that there were small figures walking around it. His wife backed him up completely. She told the same story and added that whatever they saw was not a boat. She knew the river, and she knew what belonged out there, and this definitely did not belong. And they weren't the only ones talking. All over the area, people were reporting odd lights in the sky and strange vessels moving around at night. One morning in January, a guy named Tad Jones was driving near Dunbar, West Virginia. It's about a 50-mile drive from Point Pleasant. At 9:06 p.m., he saw a large object blocking the road. At first, he thought it might be a cement truck sitting in the lane, but as he got closer, and before he could make out whatever it was, the whole thing lifted straight up into the sky. Tad shared his story with the papers, but he realized pretty quickly that that may have been a mistake. The next morning, he found a note pushed under his front door. The letters were cut out in block shapes, and it said, "We know what you have seen, and we know that you have talked. You better keep your mouth shut." Tad wasn't the only one getting threats. Mary had her own visitor. She said that she was working late one night at her desk when a man who couldn't have been more than 4.5 feet tall walks in. He had a bowl cut that looked suspiciously like a wig, and even though it was freezing cold outside, he was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. His eyes were deep set into his face, and the way he talked was strange, almost like he had just learned how to form words and sentences. He told her that he had hitchhiked from Michigan and came straight there, but he didn't have any bags or luggage with him. His eyes were almost hypnotic. He kept leaning in closer to her every time he spoke. Mary said the whole thing felt off from the moment he stepped inside the building. At one point, he notices this ballpoint pen on her desk, and he becomes completely and utterly fascinated by it. At this point, Mary just wants him to leave. So she's like, "Keep it. Keep the pen." He responds with this high-pitched, crazed, insane-sounding laugh. He grabs the pen and just bolts it out the door. And that's not even the weirdest part. A few months later, Mary saw the same man walking down the street. But before she could even process what she was seeing, a black car came around the corner. He jumped in, and the car sped off. When she told John Keel about it, he said the whole thing sounded a lot like the Men in Black, which is a common thing that is reported in other UFO cases. This black vehicle, Mary isn't the only person in town who's seen it. It keeps, stalking people in town who have been the most vocal about their Mothman encounters. It followed Linda Scarberry as she drove around town and even went through a fast food drive-thru right behind her. It nearly ran Marcella Bennett off the road, and Connie had her own run-in when a man in a black Buick tried to pull her into the car. He grabbed her hard enough to rip her shirt, but she did manage to get away. The next morning, Connie also found a note pushed under her door. It said, "Be careful, girl. I can get you yet." Now, this goes on for a few months. The black car, the threats, the strange men showing up at people's homes, the weird half-person, half-moth creature. And then in May, everything suddenly went quiet.
Love horror movies, haunted houses, creepy cult classics? Love a good drink while you scream? Then you need to check out Spooky Sips, the podcast where three spooky-loving ladies dive into horror movies old and new, all while sipping on some delicious spirits of their own. From slashers and slow burns to final girls and found footage, they bring the laughs, the screams, and the cocktails every 2 weeks. So grab your glass, hit play, and join the watch party because horror is better with friends, and maybe a little wine. New episodes every other Thursday. Listen to Spooky Sips wherever you get your podcasts.
December 15th, 1967. It's a cold Friday evening, and the Silver Bridge is packed with rush hour traffic. People are headed home from work, Christmas is coming up, and the line of cars stretches across the span between Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio. The bridge had been built back in 1928, at a time when cars were much lighter. A Model T weighed around 1,500 pounds. But by 1967, the average car was closer to 4,000, and the bridge wasn't designed with much backup support either. If one piece failed, there wasn't anything else built to take on the load. At around 5 p.m., a single eye-bar on the Ohio side cracked. That one break was enough to throw the entire structure off balance. The chain had snapped, and the bridge dropped into the Ohio River, taking cars and pedestrians with it. 46 people died, but only 44 bodies were ever recovered. People had been concerned about the bridge for years. Some said it swayed when traffic stopped on it. One survivor, Ben Cedar, said that he worried about it every time he crossed because the whole thing moved back and forth. The bridge was originally planned with wire cables, but the cheaper eye-bar design was chosen instead, making it one of the first bridges of its kind in the country. That evening, a woman named Charlene Wood was driving home. She felt a vibration under her car and backed up. As soon as she reached solid ground, the whole bridge fell in front of her. State Trooper Rudy Odell was one of the first on the scene. 31 cars and 64 people were already gone into the river. He said that he could hear people calling for help, but they were too far out for him to reach. Some survivors were pulled from the water. One man, Howard Boggs, was rescued, but his wife and child were later found in their car. Recovery took weeks because many of the vehicles were pinned under the collapsed steel. The Army Corps of Engineering brought in heavy cranes to lift the bridge pieces before the cars could be removed. 2 victims were never found. As the town tried to understand what had happened, rumors began to spread. Some locals said that they had seen strange men under the bridge in the days before the collapse. Others said that they had seen the flying creature Mothman. None of the stories were ever confirmed. Officially, the cause was the failure of a single eye-bar and a lack of structural support in the bridge's design. Some people say that Point Pleasant was never really set up for ordinary life, though. The town had a long and heavy history that almost feels like it was specifically built for folklore. And if you look far back enough, you will see why people started to think that. Long before the Mothman sightings, Point Pleasant was the site of the biggest and bloodiest fight of Lord Dunmore's War in 1774. It was a British military push into the Shawnee and Mingo territories just months before the American Revolution. After the 7-Year War, Britain had taken over French land in North America, including the region that would later become West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. Settlers moved in quickly, but the Shawnee and the Mingo had been living there for generations. In 1768, the British signed the Treaty of Fort Stanwix with the Iroquois Confederacy, claiming the land south of the Ohio River. The problem was that the indigenous communities were not a part of the agreement and they didn't accept it. So when a Virginian force came through the area in October of 1774, they were met by indigenous warriors led by Chief Cornstalk. The fighting was incredibly intense, sometimes close enough to turn into hand-to-hand combat. The Virginians eventually pushed the indigenous back, and peace followed soon after. Chief Cornstalk even became a mediator between the two sides. However, peace didn't last. In 1777, Chief Cornstalk returned to Point Pleasant on a diplomatic visit to Fort Randolph. Instead of being treated as an ally, he was taken prisoner by Commander Matthew Arbuckle. A month later, word would reach the fort that a white settler had been killed by a Shawnee. Soldiers murdered Chief Cornstalk, his son, and 2 other Shawnee men who were being held at the fort. Now, over the years, a legend formed claiming that the chief had cursed the land as he died. And some people have tried to connect that curse to the Mothman sightings and even the Silver Bridge collapse. But there's no reliable evidence that he ever said anything like that. The story more lines up with the old Indian curse trope that shows up in American horror and ghost stories. Honestly, though, Point Pleasant doesn't really need a curse to explain why it feels strange. History alone is enough. The Mothman sightings are just another layer on top of a place that has been carrying complicated stories for a very long time. So, what was Mothman? A cryptid? An alien? A misidentified bird with a gym membership? Ask 10 people in Point Pleasant and you'll get 12 answers. There are some people who suggest that the whole thing comes from inside the human mind. See, Mothman legend lines up with a lot of the demon-like shapes that people report seeing during sleep paralysis. Tall figures, big eyes, that frozen-in-place terror. Mix that with Cold War anxiety, a town full of strange sightings, and a few late-night drives through the TNT area, and it's easy to imagine people projecting their fears into whatever they think they see in the dark. This doesn't explain, though, how 4 people at the exact same time reported seeing the exact same thing. If you look at paranormal explanations, which go in a completely different direction, these theories tie together UFOs, aliens, and precognition, painting the Mothman as a sort of harbinger of doom, or, depending on who you ask, the cause of it. And that idea didn't stop at Point Pleasant. People have claimed seeing him near Chernobyl before the reactor went nuclear. Witnesses in Japan swear that they saw a winged figure before the 2011 tsunami hit. In Salem, West Virginia, people reported a similar creature right before a strange wave of child disappearances. During the 2009 swine flu outbreak in Mexico, there were reports of a dark flying figure in the weeks leading up to it. And a Georgian newspaper once interviewed Russian UFO researchers who said a Mothman-like figure was spotted in Moscow right before the 1999 apartment bombings. Are these stories confirmed? No. Are they dramatic? Absolutely. Are they the kind of thing that people whisper about at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and the dog suddenly stares at that random spot in the wall? Also, yes. The truth is, nobody knows what Mothman was or is, but plenty of people have tried to explain him. And not everybody was ready to jump straight into giant flying creature with glowing eyes. Some experts went for something a little more grounded. Mentioned Dr. Robert Smith. He's an associate professor of wildlife biology at West Virginia University, and he was one of the first people to weigh in. He didn't buy the idea of a monster stalking Point Pleasant. He suggested that the sightings were probably a sandhill crane. These birds can stand nearly as tall as a person, and they have bright red skin around their eyes. A lot of witnesses early on described something bird-like, so the theory made a lot of sense to some people. There are others who took that theory even a step further. If it was a crane, perhaps it was deformed. The sightings often happened near the old TNT area, a cluster of abandoned World War II bunkers. Locals had long believed that those bunkers leaked chemicals into the surrounding wildlife preserve. If a crane had been living out there, who knows what it might have looked like due to these chemicals. And there are some researchers who pointed out that a sandhill crane wasn't the only possibility. Great blue herons are also common in the region and can look enormous in low light, especially if someone is already on edge. In 1966, a snowy owl with nearly a 5-foot wingspan was shot in Point Pleasant and described in local papers as a giant owl. That owl is still mounted at the Mothman Museum today, and some people think that it might have sparked at least a few of those sightings. Another idea is that the whole thing was just the work of a very dedicated prankster. Someone hiding out in the old bunkers and plant, jumping out at the right moment and scaring the life out of people. It sounds ridiculous, but stranger things have happened in small towns. Skeptics like Joe Nickel have also pointed out that once the story hit the newspaper, hoaxes did start popping up, including construction workers who had tied flashlights to helium balloons. And then there's the big red eyes. Nichols has argued that the glowing red eyes people talked about were most likely the red eye effect that you get when light hits an owl's eye at night. However, John Keel recorded the story of Connie Carpenter, who said she saw the creature in broad daylight, and she still described those eyes. And as for John Keel, he's one of the most controversial figures in this story. Some people see him as a pioneer in UFOlogy, someone who pushed the field forward and asked the questions that no one else wanted to. Others see him as an opportunist who took a town's tragedy and turned it into a book deal. Both versions of him exist, depending on who you talk to. In 1975, Keel published The Mothman Prophecies, the book that permanently linked the Mothman sightings to the Silver Bridge collapse. That connection is a big part of why Point Pleasant became a magnet for conspiracy theorists, paranormal researchers, and anyone who loves a good mystery. And when the movie adaptation came out in 2002, interest in the legend exploded all over again. The film took liberties, of course. Richard Gere plays a reporter whose wife may have seen the Mothman before her death, and he somehow ends up at Point Pleasant with no memory of how he got there. Locals in the film started having visions of disasters happening far away, and there's talk of a strange figure visiting people at night. The movie doesn't offer any answers. In fact, it leans into the confusion, the unease, and the sense that something is happening just outside the edges of what people can explain. Critics were split, but the film cemented the idea of Mothman as a harbinger of doom for a whole new audience. Now, Keel's book, on the other hand, goes much deeper than the movie. It's his account of the sightings in and around Point Pleasant, woven together with his theories about UFOs, strange visitors, and the possibility that the town was experiencing some kind of collective precognition. He was one of the first to suggest that Mothman wasn't just a creature, but a warning, or maybe an observer. But regardless, Mothman was tied to the events that unfolded in the months before the bridge collapsed. Like other researchers of the era, including J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée, Keel started out believing the extraterrestrial hypothesis might explain everything. But after a year of fieldwork, he abandoned that idea. He wrote that the overlap between psychic experiences and UFO sightings was too strong to ignore. In his view, these things weren't necessarily coming from another planet. They might not even be physical in the way that we think of physical. He believed people often see what they expect to see, shaped by their culture and their fears. In later books like Operation Trojan Horse and The Eighth Tower, Keel argued that many of the world's strange events, monsters, ghosts, UFOs, poltergeists, mysterious lights, might be different faces of the same underlying phenomenon. He called the intelligence behind it ultra-terrestrials, something non-human that can appear in whatever form it chooses. In Our Haunted Planet, he even floated the idea that these beings might not be visitors at all, but something ancient and earth-based, existing alongside of us in ways that we don't understand yet. Keel has never claimed to know the purpose behind any of it. He only said that whatever the intelligence is, it does seem very interested in us. But of course, not everyone bought into his theories. In 2002, journalist John C. Sherwood published an analysis of Keel's private letters with fellow UFO writer Gary Barker. Sherwood pointed out the differences between what Keel wrote during his investigation and what he later published, raising questions about how much of the book was shaped by storytelling. Keel, known for his dry humor and outrageous correspondence, didn't clarify any of this. And really, that's the thing about John Keel. He's part researcher, part storyteller, part mystery himself. Without him, though, the Mothman legend might have stayed in local oddity. With him, it became something much bigger, a story people are still trying to untangle decades later. Hoax, crane, owl, bird, plane, Superman, or super cryptid, the truth is, nobody knows. After everything Point Pleasant has lived through, after all the sightings, the interviews, the theories, the decades of retelling, Mothman remains exactly what he started as, a mystery. Was he an omen of doom, showing up right before disaster struck? Was he the cause of it, something darker and more deliberate? Or was he a story stitched together from a town with a haunted past, a Cold War hanging over everyone's head, and the leftover uncertainty of an old war fought on the same soil? Maybe he was all of it. Maybe he was none of it. Maybe the legend grew because people needed something to point to, something to name, when the world suddenly tilted sideways. Whatever he was, Mothman has outlived the sightings, the skeptics, the experts, and even some of the people who saw him first. He's become part of the landscape, part of the folklore, part of the way Point Pleasant tells its own story. And maybe that's the real answer. Not what he was, but what he became. Something always watches from the edges of these stories, guiding you a little deeper than you meant to go. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's something older. Either way, you followed it here. I'm Amanda Joy, signing off. Thanks for wandering down this crooked path with me. Follow the path further. If this episode left you lingering in the shadows, there is more to explore. Follow at Down the Crooked Path on TikTok and Instagram for haunting visuals, behind-the-scenes lore, and updates of upcoming episodes. Every post is another breadcrumb deeper into the strange, the forgotten, and the beautifully unsettling. Stay curious and keep walking.